Story number 1. The Shadow of the Patient Room. Tom Matthews wasn't sure what he was expecting when he signed up for the tour of Waverly Hills Sanatorium, but it definitely wasn't this. He wasn't here for the thrill of ghost stories or the allure of the paranormal. No, he was here to find something. Something he couldn't even put into words. His wife, Elizabeth, had passed away 6 months ago, and he'd been wandering in a fog ever since. People told him time heals, but time didn't seem to be doing much of anything. His grief still weighed on him like a stone, and he felt its cold pressure in every corner of his house, every darkened hallway, every empty room. The sanatorium was a relic from the past, an abandoned, crumbling place that had once housed the sick and dying, the forgotten victims of tuberculosis. Now, it was a place for tourists, those curious about the haunted history it had accumulated over the years. Tom thought it might help. He wasn't sure how, but it seemed like the kind of place where you could, maybe, get some closure. Maybe the ghosts of the past would somehow help him deal with the ghosts of his own. The tour began on the main floor, where the air was thick with dust and the walls seemed to creak with the weight of memories. The guide was a woman in her early 30s, cheerful in that overcompensating way people often were when they were trying to make something that was inherently disturbing seem lighthearted. "This is where the patients would gather," she said, her voice bouncing off the walls. "It's said the patients who passed here didn't leave, but stayed, lingering." Tom nodded but didn't speak. He wasn't looking for a ghost story. He was looking for something else. The problem was, he didn't know what. He walked through the rooms, his eyes trailing over the old medical equipment that had long since been abandoned. It was as though the place was frozen in time, and for a moment, he let himself believe that somehow this would bring him peace. He would walk through these forgotten halls, feel the cold touch of the past, and find a way to move on. But that's when he first saw it. A shadow, flickering just out of the corner of his eye. He stopped, heart skipping a beat. It wasn't much at first, just a dark shape, too quick to identify, too fleeting to be certain of. He turned his head sharply, but there was nothing there. The hallway was empty, save for the peeling paint and the distant echoes of footsteps from the group ahead. "Are you okay?" the guide asked, her voice laced with concern. Tom forced a smile. "Yeah, fine, just thought I saw something." He shook his head. "I'll catch up." He walked on, but the feeling lingered. A sense of being watched. The kind of sensation you get when someone's standing right behind you, but when you turn, no one's there. The further he went, the stronger the feeling grew. At times, it felt like the walls were closing in on him. He could hear soft whispers from rooms that should have been empty, hear what sounded like soft footsteps on the creaky wooden floors, but when he checked, no one was there. His pulse quickened, and a cold sweat began to bead on his forehead. He was losing himself in the place, the shadows curling at the edges of his mind. And then he saw her, a figure, a woman, standing at the far end of the hall, just at the edge of his vision. She wasn't clear, not fully, not in any way that made sense. She was like a smear of darkness, a silhouette that was there one moment and gone the next, as if she existed between two worlds. But Tom knew that she was real. She wasn't some trick of the light or a figment of his grief. She was real, and she was waiting for him. He couldn't breathe. His legs felt like they were made of stone, but still, he stepped forward. His steps were slow, hesitant, like he was being drawn by something he couldn't fight. The whispers grew louder, but he couldn't make out the words. They twisted around him, slipping through his ears like smoke, filling him with an icy dread. He rounded a corner, and there, standing at the threshold of a patient room, was the figure again. This time, he could almost make her out. She was tall, with dark, long hair that seemed to float around her face. She wore something old, something like a hospital gown, the fabric worn and torn in places. Her face, Tom's breath caught in his throat. Her face was a blur, like the memory of a person he once knew but couldn't quite remember. Elizabeth? His voice broke, barely a whisper, but she didn't move. She just stood there, watching him with those empty, unseen eyes. The grief hit him all at once, a tidal wave that crashed over him. The weight of it, the unbearable weight. He staggered backward, almost falling as the room spun. The shadows swirled, darkened, seemed to grow taller, to lean in closer. His mind screamed at him, telling him this wasn't real, that it was just his grief, that it was just his imagination running wild. But he couldn't fight it. The deeper he went, the harder it became to tell where the sanatorium ended and his own pain began. The whispers grew louder, sharper. They surrounded him, echoing off the walls like 1,000 voices speaking at once. And then he heard it, clear as day. "Let me go." Tom froze, his heart racing, his body trembling. It wasn't the voice of the woman, the figure. It was Elizabeth's voice, the one he hadn't heard in months, the one he could still hear in his dreams, in the corners of his mind, the one that haunted him, the one he couldn't escape. "Elizabeth?" His voice broke again. "Please, I can't." The shadow of the woman stepped forward, moving closer. Tom's knees buckled beneath him, and he collapsed onto the cold floor, the tears streaming down his face. The grief was consuming him now, mixing with the horror of the sanatorium, pulling him under. He was no longer sure if he was seeing her, or if it was just his broken heart, his tortured mind. He tried to scream, but his voice wouldn't come. The whispers filled his head, louder now, drowning everything out. "Let me go." And then, just like that, she was gone. Tom was alone, sitting in the silence of the old hallways, the shadows closing in around him. The tour group had moved on, and he had lost track of time. But the grief, the emptiness, it remained, thicker than the dust in the air. And for the first time in months, Tom realized something. He might never be able to escape it. The shadow had been real. It had always been real. And as he stumbled out of the sanatorium, the whispers followed him, just behind his ear. "Let me go." Story number 2. The Wailing in the Walls. The night was heavy, thick with fog, as the group of urban explorers gathered outside the gates of Waverly Hills Sanatorium. Their flashlights flickered in the mist, casting long, wavering shadows over the decrepit building. There were 5 of them: Ethan, Sarah, Jake, Nina, and Marcus, bound together by a shared fascination with the supernatural, always chasing the next thrill. Tonight, Waverly Hills was their prize. They had heard the rumors, of course, the cries of children, the whispering ghosts, the haunting sounds that seemed to seep from the very walls. But for them, it was just another challenge, another place to explore and document. Nothing more. "All right, guys, let's stick together," Ethan said, his voice breaking through the nervous silence. He clicked his camera on, the red light blinking to life in the dark. "We're here for the footage, and we're gonna get it. Just remember, don't let the legends get in your head. Focus." Sarah, always the skeptic, rolled her eyes. "Ethan, we've been through places like this before. Ghosts don't exist." But there was something in the air tonight. It was heavy, almost suffocating, and even Sarah couldn't deny that feeling. As they made their way through the rusted gates and onto the overgrown path leading to the main entrance, the sound of distant wind howling seemed to echo through the empty grounds, making it feel even more deserted. The sanatorium loomed above them, its windows dark and lifeless. The stone walls cracked and chipped, like the ruins of something that had been forgotten for far too long. As they entered, the silence inside was suffocating, the air thick with dust and decay. They made their way through the dark hallways, the only sound their footsteps echoing off the walls. The floors creaked beneath their weight, the ancient building groaning like it was alive, as if it were reacting to their presence. The temperature dropped as they ventured deeper, and the feeling of unease only grew stronger. And then they heard it, a soft, mournful cry, like the wail of a baby, echoed from somewhere deep within the walls. The sound was faint at first, like a whisper, but it grew louder, more insistent, as though something, or someone, was calling out for help. Jake, the most daring of the group, was the first to react. He stopped dead in his tracks, tilting his head, listening. "Did you hear that?" "I thought it was just the wind," Marcus muttered, but his voice faltered. There was something in that cry, something raw and desperate, that made him doubt his own words. "It's coming from the walls," Nina said, her voice barely a whisper. Do you think it's real?" The cry came again, louder this time, unmistakable. It was the sound of a baby, wailing in distress, as though trapped in some unseen prison. The group exchanged uneasy glances. They had come for the paranormal, yes, but they hadn't expected this. "Let's find it," Ethan said, determination in his voice. "If it's real, we can get it on tape." But as they moved through the hallways, following the sound, something strange began to happen. The rooms around them seemed to shift, the doors opening and closing on their own, leading them in circles. They passed the same rooms over and over again, as though the building itself was toying with them. The wail grew louder, more frantic, urging them on. "Guys, this isn't right," Sarah said, her voice trembling. She reached for the door of a nearby room, but as she touched the handle, the wailing stopped abruptly. For a moment, there was complete silence. Then it came. Whispers. Soft at first, like a faint breeze, but growing louder, more insistent. The voices seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Help us," they pleaded. The voices of children, begging, crying, desperate. The room they had just entered was empty. At least, it seemed empty. The walls were covered in peeling paint, and broken windows let in slivers of moonlight. But something wasn't right. The air felt wrong. It was thick, heavy, as if it had absorbed something terrible. Jake was the first to snap. "This is messed up. We need to get out of here." His voice cracked, the calm bravado slipping away. But the doors wouldn't open. They were locked from the outside, no matter how much they pulled and shoved at the handles. Panic began to seep in. They pounded on the wall, shouting for help, but the wailing returned, louder now, vibrating the very floor beneath their feet. Then, the whispers started again. "Help us. Help us." Nina backed away from the walls, her eyes wide with fear. She swore she could see something moving beneath the surface of the cracked plaster. Faint, twisted shapes. Hands, faces, pressed against the walls, like children trapped in a nightmare. "We need to get out," Marcus shouted, his voice cracking, but there was nowhere to go. The walls closed in, the shadows grew darker, and the whispers filled their heads. The building was alive now, alive in a way that twisted the reality of everything they thought they knew. The cries of babies grew louder, mingled with the whispers of long-dead children, their voices echoing in the corners of the room, in the spaces between the walls, in their minds. The explorers scrambled, frantically searching for a way out, but the hallway twisted like a labyrinth, the rooms shifting as if the building itself were a living thing, hungry and waiting. The shadows seemed to move, stretching out toward them as if reaching for their souls. Ethan fell to his knees, clutching his camera as if it could somehow save him. "We're trapped," he gasped. "We're trapped in this place." And then, with a sickening jolt, the floor beneath them cracked open. The group screamed as they were pulled down into the dark, endless void beneath the sanatorium. The last thing they heard was the wailing, a child's cry, soft and pleading, and then nothing. In the days that followed, the sanatorium remained as silent as ever. The whispers, the cries, the voices, all of it gone. But the building still stood, waiting. And somewhere, in the shifting walls of Waverly Hills, the echoes of those lost souls lingered, trapped forever in the dark corners of the labyrinth. The wailing in the walls continued. Story number 3. The Last Tour. Daniel Evans stood at the gates of Waverly Hills Sanatorium, the weight of the camera on his shoulder a constant reminder of the journey he had started. He had filmed in some of the most haunted places in the world, but Waverly Hills was different. There was something about this place, something old, ancient, buried deep within the walls, that called to him. The stories of the tortured souls who had once lived there, the whispers of the past that still echoed in its empty halls, had all become part of the legend. And Daniel wanted to capture it all. He had been hired by a small documentary production company to film one last tour of the sanatorium. They didn't know what he knew, that this wasn't just another abandoned building. Waverly Hills had its secrets, and Daniel was determined to uncover them. The crew was small, just 3 people. There was Sarah, the camera operator, whose quiet determination made her the perfect partner in this kind of work. Then there was Mike, the sound guy, whose easygoing attitude and love for the bizarre had him almost eager for the terrifying rumors surrounding the place to be true. And finally, there was Daniel, always behind the camera, always looking for the perfect shot, the perfect moment of terror. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the cracked stone facade of the building, Daniel felt a shiver run down his spine. It wasn't the cold that made his skin prickle, though. It was something else. The air felt thick, almost heavy, like the entire world had taken a deep breath and held it in anticipation. "All right," Daniel said, trying to sound confident as he adjusted his camera and looked at the others. "Let's make this count. We're going to capture the heart of Waverly Hills tonight. Its spirit, its story." Mike nodded, setting up his equipment with a grin. "This place is perfect for a documentary. The stories, the history, there's no shortage of creepy stuff here." Sarah, her eyes scanning the darkening building, didn't look so sure. "I've heard the stories," she said quietly, "but you know, sometimes it's better not to dig too deep." Daniel gave her a reassuring smile, but even he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling gnawing at his gut. He had done plenty of ghost hunts, filmed enough haunted locations to know what to expect. But tonight, something felt different. Something was waiting. As they stepped inside, the temperature dropped. The air was thick with the scent of decay and mildew, the silence so complete it was almost deafening. They made their way through the main hall, the faint rustling of their footsteps the only sound. The place was still. Too still. The walls, scarred by time and neglect, seemed to lean in toward them, like the building itself was watching, listening. "All right," Daniel said, trying to lighten the mood. "We'll start with the first floor. We'll capture some of the historical footage. But remember, the heart of the story is the experience, the spirit of this place." As they moved deeper into the building, Sarah began to feel it. The unease that had settled in her chest, the whispers that seemed to come from nowhere, the soft scrape of something moving against the floor just out of sight. She glanced around, her eyes catching fleeting glimpses of shadows darting behind doors and windows. But when she turned her flashlight toward them, nothing was there. She wasn't alone, though. Something was there. Something was watching them. "You feel that?" she whispered to Mike, who had a smile plastered on his face, but his eyes were wide, darting nervously around the room. "I feel it," Mike replied, his voice tense. "I thought I heard something. Behind us." Before Daniel could respond, a sound echoed down the hallway. A faint tapping, like footsteps dragging across the floor. It was far away, but it was getting closer, each footfall heavier than the last. "Did you hear that?" Daniel said, his voice tight. "It's probably just the building settling," Mike offered, but there was no mistaking the nervous edge in his tone. But Daniel wasn't so sure. He knew the history of the place, how Waverly Hills had been home to countless deaths, to the victims of tuberculosis who had suffered and perished within these walls. It was rumored that the spirits of the patients who never made it out still wandered the halls, trapped in the grip of a never-ending nightmare. The crew moved cautiously forward, the air growing heavier with each step. And then, from the darkness ahead, the sound came again. This time, unmistakable. A dragging, shuffling sound, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. "Sarah, you're on point," Daniel said, trying to stay calm. "Get a shot of this." As Sarah lifted the camera to her eye, she froze. Through the lens, she could see something moving, something dragging itself toward them, slow and deliberate, through the dark hallway. A shape, large and misshapen, something that didn't belong in the realm of the living. Her breath caught in her throat, but she couldn't look away. The shape was getting closer, its dragging noise growing louder, and the shadows around them seemed to grow darker, thicker. "What is that?" Sarah whispered, backing away. But it wasn't just the dragging sound that filled the air now. No, it was something worse. A low, guttural growl, as if the walls themselves were alive, as if the very building was breathing, pulsing with an energy that was not human. The growl faded, replaced by a voice, a soft, distant whisper that came from the walls themselves. "Leave. Now." Daniel's heart pounded in his chest, and his breath caught in his throat. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't some recording, it was real. The building was speaking. "Get out!" The voice was sharper now, more insistent, echoing in their ears, the sound of the past clawing its way into the present. The crew backed away, but the door to the exit was gone. There was no way out. The hallway had changed, the rooms had shifted, and what had once been a straight path was now a maze of dark corridors and locked doors. They were trapped. Suddenly, the growl returned, louder, closer, and the temperature dropped even further, frost creeping along the edges of the walls. The shadows seemed to stretch toward them, darker and deeper, as if the building was reaching for them, pulling them closer to its cold, hollow heart. "Run," Daniel said, his voice shaking as panic set in. But it was already too late. The walls seemed to close in around them, the hallway twisting in impossible ways, leading them deeper and deeper into the heart of the sanatorium. The shadows whispered, the growls grew louder, and the voices from the past, voices of the dead patients, the tortured souls of Waverly Hills, began to rise in unison. "Help us. Please. Leave us." But there was no escaping now. The building had them, and it was not going to let them go. As the last remnants of light faded from their flashlights, the crew realized the terrible truth. Waverly Hills wasn't just abandoned, it was alive, and they were going to become part of its story, forever. The doors were gone, the walls were closing in, the last tour had begun. Story number 4. The Nurse's Secret. It was the summer of 1927 when Evelyn Grant first arrived at Waverly Hills Sanatorium. A fresh-faced young nurse with no more than a year of training under her belt, she was eager to prove herself, to make a difference in the lives of the patients who had come to this place seeking a cure for tuberculosis. The sanatorium, a sprawling Gothic structure perched on a hill like a forgotten castle, had a reputation for caring for the sick, but it also had a darker undercurrent, a whisper of something unspoken, something people spoke of only in hushed tones. At first, the work was as she expected: long hours, endless rounds, and the occasional patient who slipped away quietly in the night. She had seen death before, but it was always something clinical, something that could be explained by science and reason. At least it was, until the whispers began. It started slowly. A patient in room 217, an older man who had been battling the disease for months, began mumbling about a woman in the walls. At first, Evelyn dismissed it as delirium, a side effect of the fever. But when the man's condition worsened overnight, he began screaming, his voice full of terror. "She's here! She's coming for me!" he cried, thrashing in his bed, his hands reaching out for something unseen. Evelyn and the doctor tried everything they could to calm him down, but nothing worked. The man died just a few hours later, his eyes wide open, staring at nothing. It was then that Evelyn noticed something odd. The walls of the room, no, the whole corridor, seemed to be different. The air was thick, as though the building itself was breathing, pulsing with a presence she couldn't explain. She shook it off, blaming fatigue. But the feeling stayed with her, gnawing at the back of her mind. A week later, another patient, a young woman named Clara, came in with a similar story. She was dying, as all of them were, but she hadn't yet succumbed to the disease. One evening, as Evelyn sat by her bedside, Clara spoke in a low voice, her words slow and deliberate. "There's a man in the hall. He stands there, watching me." Evelyn tried to reassure her, but Clara's voice grew more frantic. "He has a face like a mask. His eyes are hollow. He wants me to follow him." Evelyn felt a chill run down her spine. "It's just your fever talking, Clara," she said gently. But Clara's eyes, wide and filled with terror, never left the doorway. That night, Evelyn lay awake in her small room, listening to the distant sounds of the sanatorium settling into the darkness. She heard something else, though. A faint scratching noise, like nails dragging along the floorboards. When she finally fell asleep, she dreamed of a long hallway with closed doors on either side, each one cracked open just enough to reveal the shadow of something moving inside. There was a figure, a woman, wearing an old-fashioned nurse's uniform, her face obscured, but her eyes full of grief. The figure beckoned her forward, but Evelyn couldn't move. She was frozen, watching as the woman faded into the walls, leaving behind only an echo of a scream. The next morning, Evelyn felt unsettled but dismissed it as just a bad dream. She tried to focus on her work, but the strange occurrences seemed to multiply. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that there were eyes on her in every corner. And when she passed by the old storage room, she would sometimes hear faint whispers, like a conversation happening just beyond her reach. Her patients, too, began to speak more often of strange visions, of figures in the corners of their rooms, of shadows moving just outside their windows. One night, an elderly woman named Mrs. Thompson, whose mind had long been dulled by the disease, called Evelyn to her bedside in a panic. She had been sitting up, trembling, staring at the door. "He's here, the doctor, the one with the mask." Evelyn tried to comfort her, but Mrs. Thompson's eyes locked on something behind Evelyn. "No, don't let him take me," she pleaded, her voice quivering. "Who, Mrs. Thompson?" Evelyn asked, her voice steady despite the growing unease in her chest. "The doctor," Mrs. Thompson repeated, her voice shaking. "The one with the mask. He's been in the walls, watching us. He's the one who makes us scream." That night, Evelyn could no longer ignore the mounting fear that had taken root inside her. She went to the old hospital records, searching for something, anything, that might explain the strange happenings. She discovered a collection of notes, scrawled hastily, almost as though the writer was desperate to leave some kind of warning. The notes spoke of the experiments conducted in the early years of the sanatorium's operation. Gruesome procedures, designed not to cure, but to control. The doctors had tested new treatments, yes, but they had also performed strange, cruel experiments on the patients, pushing the limits of pain and suffering in search of answers that were never meant to be found. And then she found it, the name that chilled her to the bone. Dr. William Pierce, a prominent figure in the early days of the sanatorium. The records described how he had vanished suddenly, without a trace, but not before he had left behind a legacy of horror. The whispers spoke of his obsession with the human soul, of his experiments that had left patients irreparably scarred, their spirits lingering in the walls long after their bodies had died. Evelyn could feel her heart racing in her chest as she read on, the truth becoming clearer with each passing word. The sanatorium wasn't just a place of sickness. It was a tomb, a prison for the souls of those who had suffered within its walls. And Dr. Pierce, it seemed, hadn't just experimented on the patients. He had experimented on the very building itself, trying to unlock the door between life and death. As Evelyn delved deeper into the history, the spirits of the past grew stronger. She began to see them, pale, shadowy figures in the halls, nurses in old uniforms, their faces hidden by time. They would appear just out of reach, their eyes hollow, their expressions frozen in fear. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, calling her name, urging her to follow them. One evening, as Evelyn sat alone in the nurse's station, a cold wind swept through the room. The lights flickered, and she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching from the hallway. She looked up, and there, standing at the door, was the woman from her dream, the nurse in the old uniform, her face still obscured, but her eyes now visible. There was no grief in them now, only a terrible, hollow emptiness. "Help us," the nurse whispered, her voice like a fading echo. "The walls, they hold the truth." Evelyn stood frozen, a cold sweat breaking out on her forehead. She knew then that she could never escape this place. She was bound to it, as were the spirits of the lost, the victims of Dr. Pierce's cruel experiments. The sanatorium was alive with their suffering, their anger, and it was pulling her deeper into its web. As she turned to flee, she heard the whispers once more, louder this time, closing in around her. She could feel the walls shifting, bending, as though they were alive, as though they were trying to swallow her whole. And for the first time, Evelyn realized the terrible truth. She wasn't just a nurse in Waverly Hills. She was part of its story now, a story that would never end. Story number 5. The Ghost of Room 502. Ethan Carter had always been the type of journalist who thrived on the unknown. The darker, the better. He'd made a career out of chasing ghost stories, debunking myths, and unearthing the truth behind so-called paranormal phenomena. But when the story came across his desk about Room 502 at Waverly Hills Sanatorium, something about it lingered in the back of his mind. It wasn't just the usual ghost story. It was different. There was a darkness to it, something beyond just the typical chilling tale. Room 502 had a reputation, a bad one. It was infamous, whispered about by staff and patients alike. Over the years, countless people had died there. Patients who had succumbed to tuberculosis, yes, but also suicides, mysterious disappearances, and stories of a figure, pale and gaunt, standing at the window. The rumors painted the room as cursed, a place where the living and the dead were locked in some twisted dance. No one had stayed in room 502 for long, not after the stories started, and especially not after the nurses and staff began to see the figure themselves. Ethan didn't believe in ghosts. At least he hadn't. He was a man of reason, of facts. But the mystery of room 502 gnawed at him, an itch he couldn't scratch. He had to see it for himself, investigate the room, get the facts. So he packed his things, grabbed his camera, and set off to Waverly Hills. When he arrived at the sanatorium, the place seemed like something out of a nightmare. Its towering structure loomed over him like a forgotten monument, its windows dark and vacant, like dead eyes staring down at the world. The wind howled through the empty halls, rattling the loose windows. Inside, the building smelled of mildew, rot, and the lingering stench of decay. But there was something else, something that settled in the pit of his stomach, a heaviness in the air, as though the place had a life of its own, like it was breathing. He met with the caretaker, an older man named Carl, who had worked at Waverly Hills for decades. Carl's face was lined with age and worry, his eyes tired and distant, like someone who had seen too much in his lifetime. "Room 502, Carl said, his voice trembling just a little as he spoke. "You sure about this, Mr. Carter? People like you come in here thinking they know it all, but they never leave the same." Ethan, trying to shake off the unease creeping up his spine, nodded. "I'll be fine. Just need the truth. That's all." Carl hesitated, glancing over his shoulder before speaking again. "The truth? Well, you might get it, but it'll cost you something." Ethan didn't know what he meant by that, but he didn't press the issue. He was here for answers, the truth. When Carl unlocked the door to room 502, Ethan's heart skipped a beat. The room was small, almost claustrophobic, with faded wallpaper peeling at the edges. The bed was still made, the sheets stiff and unused, as if no one had touched them in years. The air was thick with dust, the silence deafening. It was the kind of room that made your skin crawl, as though something was waiting just beyond your line of sight. He set up his camera, adjusting the lens, capturing the room's eerie stillness. The rumors had said that the ghost of a woman, pale and lifeless, could sometimes be seen standing at the window, her figure barely visible in the glass. He stared at the window, his mind racing through the stories, the legends, the tales of tragedy. He wanted to dismiss it all, but there was something in the room, something that made his breath catch in his throat. He sat down, trying to keep his focus, the weight of the room pressing down on him. But then, it happened. A soft sound, a whisper, like a breath brushing against his ear. He jerked his head around, but the room was empty. His pulse quickened, his instinct screaming that he wasn't alone. He glanced at the window again, but this time, something was different. The glass was fogged, streaked with condensation, and for a split second, he thought he saw something move. Something dark and shadowy, standing at the window, staring out into the darkness. Ethan stood up, his camera clutched tightly in his hands. "Hello?" he called, his voice barely above a whisper. "Is anyone there?" No answer. Just the silence of the room, thick and suffocating. He moved toward the window, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The figure, if it had been a figure, was gone, leaving nothing but the fogged glass. He wiped a hand across the window, clearing the condensation, but there was nothing. No shadow, no figure, just the empty night beyond. His heart pounded in his chest as he turned back to the room. He had to be imagining things. This place was playing tricks on his mind. But then he heard it again. The whisper, louder this time. It was coming from the walls. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't just a draft. It was a voice, soft and desperate, like someone trying to get his attention. "Help me." Ethan's mind raced. Was it a patient's voice? Was it a memory of someone who had died here? He pressed his hand against the wall, feeling the coldness seep into his skin, and that's when it hit him. The room was alive. It was as if the very walls were alive, absorbing the pain, the suffering, the souls of those who had died here. Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped. His breath fogged in front of him, and the walls seemed to pulse with a low, throbbing hum. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if they were coming from all directions at once. Ethan's mind was reeling. "This isn't real," he thought, trying to convince himself. "I'm just exhausted. It's all in my head." But when he turned toward the window again, he saw it. The figure. The woman. Her pale face was pressed against the glass, her eyes wide with terror, her hands reaching out as if she were begging for something, for release, for escape. And then, just as quickly as she had appeared, she was gone, vanishing into the glass like smoke. Ethan stumbled back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The room seemed to tilt, the walls closing in on him. He didn't know what was happening, but he felt the weight of something dark, something ancient, pulling him deeper into the room. The whispers in his ears grew louder, more insistent. He turned to leave, but the door was gone. There was no exit, no way out. And then, just as it all started to close in, he saw it again. Just a flash, a fleeting image of the woman in the window, her face full of anguish. "Help me," she whispered, her voice thick with despair. But Ethan wasn't sure anymore if he was hearing her, or if he was losing his mind. The walls were closing in, the room was alive, and he was starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, the ghost of room 502 wasn't haunting the room. Maybe it was haunting his mind, warping his perception, pulling him into a place where nothing was real anymore. And as the whispers consumed him, he realized that the truth had already been revealed. He was the one trapped now. He was the one who would never leave. The last thing he heard was her voice, clear and cold, echoing in the darkness. "Help me, or stay with me forever." Story number 6. The Echo of the Tuberculosis Ward. Raymond Miller had never planned on returning to Waverly Hills Sanatorium. Not in a million years. But life, as it often does, had a way of surprising him. He was old now, frail even, with a body that creaked and groaned every time he moved. His hair had thinned over the years, turning the color of ash, and his skin had the texture of old paper, wrinkled and brittle. But his eyes, those eyes, still burned with the fire of the young man who had once fought to survive in this place. It had been decades since he was here, in this very building, fighting the disease that had nearly killed him. Tuberculosis. The name alone was enough to send chills down anyone's spine, but for Raymond, it was something far more personal. It had taken the lives of so many, his friends, his roommates, people he had watched fade away in those sterile, white rooms. But Raymond had survived. The doctors had called him lucky. He had called it a miracle. But now, standing in front of the dilapidated gates of the sanatorium, Raymond wasn't sure what to believe anymore. The sanatorium had been abandoned for years, left to rot like so many of its patients. There were rumors, stories that had floated through the years, that the spirits of those who had died here still haunted the halls. Raymond didn't believe in ghosts. Not then, and certainly not now. But something in his gut told him that this place was different, that maybe there was more to his survival than simple chance. He pushed open the gates, the rusty hinges creaking like the sound of bones protesting after years of disuse. The air smelled of rot, of decay, of something that had long been forgotten. But the memories came rushing back as soon as he stepped onto the grounds. The walls, the long hallways, the endless rows of empty beds, and the hushed voices of the dying. It was all here, just as he remembered. But something felt off, like a shadow that clung to the edges of his mind, pulling at his thoughts. Raymond made his way inside, careful not to slip on the crumbling floorboards, the weight of the past pressing down on him with every step. He hadn't meant to come back here. Not really, but something had been calling him. Something he couldn't shake. Something that had been gnawing at him for years. He had to know the truth. Why had he survived when so many others had died? Why had he been spared? He had to find the answers, even if it meant returning to the place where it all began. As he wandered through the empty hallways, a chill settled over him, colder than the air outside. The place was eerily quiet, but it wasn't the silence of an abandoned building. No, this silence was different. It was alive, pregnant with something unspeakable. He could almost hear the whispers, distant voices, muffled and faint, as though they were coming from somewhere just beyond his reach. He stopped in his tracks, his heart thudding in his chest, and listened. Nothing. Just the sound of his own breath, shallow and uneven. But then there it was again. A whisper, soft and low, just at the edge of his hearing. His pulse quickened. He wasn't alone. "Hello?" he called out, his voice shaky. No answer. But the whispers continued, swirling around him, filling the space, making his head ache with the pressure. The walls seemed to pulse, to breathe, as if the building itself were alive, remembering the horrors it had witnessed all those years ago. He made his way down to the tuberculosis ward, the heart of the sanatorium. The door to the ward was ajar, as though inviting him in. He pushed it open, and the air inside was thick, heavy with the weight of the past. The room was dimly lit by the light streaming in through cracked windows, casting long, jagged shadows across the floor. The beds were gone, but the walls still bore the scars of the countless lives that had been lost here. Raymond felt something stir within him, something old, something buried deep in his memory. He could almost hear the coughing, the wheezing, the desperate cries for help. He could almost see the faces of the men and women who had died here, their faces pale and gaunt, their eyes hollow with fear. But the most vivid memory was his own. The memory of his time in this ward, lying in a bed just like the others, wondering if he too would be taken by the disease. And then, as if the walls themselves were speaking, Raymond felt it. A coldness creeping up his spine. A presence in the room that wasn't just a memory. The air shifted, and the temperature dropped. Raymond turned around, his eyes scanning the empty room, and that's when he saw it. A figure standing in the corner, just out of reach. A man, dressed in the old faded hospital gown of a patient, his face pale and expressionless. The figure didn't move, but Raymond could feel its eyes on him, could feel the weight of its gaze. For a moment, Raymond stood frozen, his breath catching in his throat. The figure didn't speak, but Raymond could hear its voice, soft and distant, echoing in his mind. "You should have died here with us." The words were like a slap to his face, cutting through the silence with a jagged edge. Raymond's heart raced, his mind spinning. The whispers in the room grew louder, more insistent, filling his ears, drowning out his thoughts. The walls seemed to close in around him, the air thick with the stench of death. And then it hit him, the realization, sudden and terrible. His survival wasn't a miracle, it wasn't luck. It had been planned. The doctors, the experiments, the trials. Everything had been part of a darker, more sinister plan. He hadn't been saved. He had been chosen. Chosen to survive. Chosen to witness the horrors that had unfolded in this place. The figure in the corner stepped forward, its face now visible, twisted in pain and anguish. The voice came again, louder this time, like a scream in his head. "You should have died with us." Raymond stumbled backward, his legs weak, his mind unraveling. The room seemed to spin, the walls closing in tighter, the whispers filling his head like a drumbeat. He wasn't just hearing the voices of the dead anymore, he was becoming one of them. And then the figure lunged at him, its hands reaching for his throat, pulling him down into the darkness, into the very heart of Waverly Hills' twisted past. When they found Raymond's body, it was lying in the middle of the tuberculosis ward, eyes wide open, staring into nothingness. His death was ruled natural, the result of old age. But no one could explain the expression on his face, the look of terror, the look of a man who had seen something so dark, so unspeakable, that it had driven him mad. And the whispers? They didn't stop. The echoes of the past continued to haunt the walls of Waverly Hills, calling out to the living, waiting for the next soul to enter the ward, waiting for the next survivor. Story number 7. The Last Days of the Director. Dr. Thomas Halloran had once been a man of great promise. In the early days, he had been known for his ambition, his unshakable belief that a cure for tuberculosis was just within reach. He was the director of Waverly Hills Sanatorium, a sprawling facility on the edge of a hill, far removed from the rest of the world. The building, with its long, empty hallways and windows that seemed to stare out into nothing, was a place where the sick came to die. But Dr. Halloran saw it differently. He saw it as his laboratory, his battleground against death. He was convinced that the cure was in his grasp. All he had to do was push a little further, dig a little deeper. At first, it was the usual methods: experimental drugs, treatments that were considered cutting edge at the time. But as the months dragged on and the patients continued to die in spite of his best efforts, Dr. Halloran's frustration grew. His obsession with finding a cure began to overtake him. He began to believe that the answer lay not just in medicine, but in the human soul itself. It was then that the experiments began. The patients who were no longer responding to traditional treatments were chosen, often without their consent. They were strapped to tables, subjected to horrific procedures that would have been unthinkable in any other place, under any other circumstances. Dr. Halloran called it experimental therapy, though even he knew it was something far darker. The line between science and madness began to blur. It wasn't long before the patients started to notice the changes in the director. At first, it was subtle. His eyes a little too wide, his smile a little too forced. Then the whispers began. Whispers that filled the halls of Waverly Hills, creeping under the doors and into the minds of the people trapped within. Some of the patients swore they saw him walking the hallways late at night, his silhouette flickering in the dim light of the sanatorium. But when they called out to him, he didn't respond. He would simply disappear into the shadows, as if he were one of them, lost, forgotten. By the time the winter of 1932 rolled around, Dr. Halloran's mind was already beginning to fracture. The experiments had taken their toll, not just on his patients, but on him as well. He began hearing voices. At first, it was just whispers, barely audible, like the wind brushing against the walls. But as the weeks passed, the voices grew louder, more distinct. He could hear them in the halls and the rooms, sometimes even in his own office. The voices of the patients, those who had died, those who had suffered under his hands. "Help us. Why did you do this? Set us free. It was driving him mad, but he couldn't stop. The obsession was all-consuming. Every new experiment, every new patient, every new failure only fueled the fire inside him. He was so close to discovering the cure, he could feel it. The patients who had survived the longest were the ones who showed him the way, their bodies and minds stretched to their breaking point, but still clinging to life. One night, after yet another failed attempt at a new treatment, Dr. Halloran walked into the tuberculosis ward. It was late, the building dark except for the flickering lights in the hallway. The air felt thick, oppressive, like something was waiting. The patients' rooms were quiet, but Dr. Halloran couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. He stood in the center of the ward, breathing heavily, listening, and then he heard it. A soft scraping sound, like nails against the floor. He turned, his heart hammering in his chest, and saw something that made his blood run cold. A figure, hunched and pale, stood in the doorway of one of the rooms. The figure was wearing a hospital gown, its face obscured by the shadows. But Dr. Halloran knew who it was. He could feel it in his bones. It was one of the patients who had died under his care. A woman, her name lost to time, but her face still burned in his memory. "Please, you have to stop." The voice came from the figure, a hoarse whisper that sent shivers down his spine. "You've made us suffer. Too much." Dr. Halloran took a step back, his breath quickening. He reached for the nearest light switch, but it flickered and died before he could touch it. The figure stepped forward, its movement slow and deliberate, the floor creaking under its weight. No, you're not real," Dr. Halloran muttered to himself, his voice shaky. He stumbled backward, his legs suddenly weak, but the figure followed him, its presence pressing in on him from all sides. "I am real," the voice said again, louder this time. "We are real, all of us, and we will never leave you." Dr. Halloran turned and ran. He fled down the long hallway, his footsteps echoing against the walls. But no matter how fast he ran, the voices followed him. The whispers, the cries for help. They were everywhere. They were in the walls, in the floors, in his mind. His eyes darted back and forth, searching for an escape, but there was none. The building, once a place of healing, had turned into a prison. And now, Dr. Halloran was the one trapped inside. In the days that followed, his behavior became even more erratic. He started talking to the walls, speaking to the voices that only he could hear. He would pace up and down the hallways, muttering under his breath about the cure, about his experiments, about the patients who wouldn't leave him alone. One by one, the other staff members began to leave the sanatorium. The whispers had gotten to them too. They couldn't take it anymore. The building, it seemed, had a way of swallowing people whole, and no one was immune to its horrors. By the time the last of the staff left, Dr. Halloran had become a mere shadow of the man he once was. His obsession had consumed him completely. He could no longer distinguish between reality and nightmare. The spirits of the patients had taken over his mind, their cries echoing in his ears, their faces haunting his every waking moment. And then, one fateful night, when the wind howled through the cracks in the walls and the darkness was thick with the weight of the past, Dr. Halloran disappeared. No one knows what happened to him. Some say he walked into the night, his mind lost forever to the very darkness he had created. Others say he was claimed by the spirits, dragged into the shadows by the ghosts of those he had condemned. But one thing was certain. Dr. Thomas Halloran became more than just a man. He became a part of the legend, a ghost among ghosts, a part of the very fabric of Waverly Hills. And when people speak of the sanatorium, they still speak of the director who was driven mad by his own obsession, the man whose desperate search for a cure led him to become one of its most terrifying legends. The whispers still linger in the halls, and the echoes of Dr. Halloran's final days can still be heard, if you listen closely enough. Story number 8, The Silent Halls. Lena and David had always dreamed of a house in the country, a place far from the chaos of the city, a home where they could start fresh. When they found the small charming house on the outskirts of Louisville, they thought they had hit the jackpot. It was quiet, peaceful, and surrounded by trees. The price was right too, and the realtor made sure to mention the view of the old Waverly Hills Sanatorium just down the road. "They say it's haunted," the realtor said with a half-smile, clearly enjoying the drama of it. "But that's just local legend. The place has been abandoned for years, doesn't even look like a hospital anymore." Lena and David laughed it off. They didn't believe in ghosts or haunted houses. They were more concerned about getting the living room decorated before winter. The first few nights were exactly what they expected. Peaceful, serene. The house had an odd charm, the kind you could only find in old places. The wooden floors creaked as they walked across them, and the windows rattled in the breeze, but it was cozy. Nothing to worry about. Until the noises started. At first, it was just a soft thud, like something heavy being dropped in the next room. David assumed it was just the house settling, an old building after all. But then, one night they both heard it. A faint tapping sound, like footsteps pacing back and forth down the hall. They exchanged nervous glances, but again, shrugged it off. Old houses made strange noises. Nothing to worry about. But as the days passed, the sounds grew louder, more persistent. The faint footsteps turned into distinct, deliberate steps. Someone walking down the hallway when no one was there. And then, the whispers. Low, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to seep through the walls. Lena tried to convince herself it was just the wind, the house's creaks, or maybe even the pipes. But David was less convinced. One night, as the whispers grew louder, he got out of bed and walked to the hallway, his footsteps echoing in the silence. But when he reached the doorway, there was nothing. Just an empty hall. "We're hearing things," Lena said the next morning, trying to brush it off, but even she couldn't deny the chill in the air, the heaviness that seemed to hang in the house. They began avoiding the hallways at night, staying in the kitchen or the living room where the sounds didn't seem to reach. But the house was starting to feel different, unwelcoming, darker even during the daytime. David started researching the history of the sanatorium, hoping to find an explanation for the strange things happening around them. Waverly Hills Sanatorium had been a place of suffering. Opened in 1910 to treat patients with tuberculosis, it had become notorious for its harsh treatments and even harsher conditions. Thousands had died there, many of them young, their bodies ravaged by a disease that had no cure. The sanatorium had closed its doors in the 1960s, but the stories of its dark past never left. People talked about the strange experiments conducted on patients, the deaths, the whispers of tortured souls still trapped within its walls. As David read more, the house seemed to grow colder, the air thicker. He could hear the whispers now too, voices that seemed to come from nowhere. They started to feel like they were being watched, like the house wasn't just a house anymore. It was a prison for the souls of the past, a place where the memories of the dying clung to the walls, suffocating everything around them. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the whispering grew louder, more urgent. David and Lena stood in the living room, frozen, listening. It was no longer just whispers, it was words now, pleas for help, cries of pain. "We have to leave," Lena whispered, clutching David's arm. But David shook his head. "We can't just leave. We need to know what's happening here." Against Lena's better judgment, David insisted they explore the sanatorium. He believed that if they understood the history of the place, they could break free of whatever curse had seeped into their home. But the closer they got to the building, the stronger the pull became. It was as if the sanatorium itself was calling to them, luring them in. When they arrived at the gates, the towering structure loomed before them, casting long shadows in the fading light. The windows were dark and empty, like hollow eyes staring down at them. The air was thick with decay, the smell of mildew and rot overwhelming. It felt as though the very ground beneath their feet had soaked up years of suffering. They ventured inside, moving cautiously through the decaying hallways. The further they went, the colder it got. The walls seemed to breathe, the floors creaking beneath their weight. It was a place of death, a place that had been filled with the desperate, the dying, and the forgotten. As they passed a row of rooms, the whispers began again. Louder now, more distinct. They could hear voices crying out, begging for help. But when they turned the corner, there was no one there. And then they saw it. At the end of the hallway, standing in the doorway of one of the rooms, was a figure. A woman, pale and gaunt, her eyes wide with terror. She didn't move, but her presence filled the room, pressing in on them from all sides. Lena froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Who are you?" David managed to whisper, his voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. She simply raised her hand, pointing toward the far end of the hall. A low, guttural moan filled the air, followed by a chorus of voices. Voices of those who had died here, trapped in the sanatorium for eternity. Lena grabbed David's arm, pulling him back. "We need to go, now!" They ran, their footsteps echoing in the halls, but the house, the sanatorium, seemed to twist around them. The walls closed in, the shadows moved, shifting like living things, and the whispers followed, growing louder, until they felt like they were in their heads, in their hearts, in their very souls. When they finally escaped and returned to the house, they thought they were safe. But they were wrong. The house had already taken them in. The whispers didn't stop. The footsteps didn't fade. The house, the sanatorium, had become part of them. The dark energy had seeped into their bones, into their blood. They were no longer visitors, they were part of the legacy. And as the years passed, they too became whispers, their voices lost in the silent halls, waiting for the next victims to take their place. Story number 9, The Forgotten Souls. The team had been warned. Everyone who'd come before them had turned back, with the air thick with rumors and stories of the forgotten souls that roamed the halls of Waverly Hills Sanatorium. But a good story was hard to resist, and for a group of paranormal investigators like Gabe, Amelia, Rob, and Cassie, this was the big one, the one that would cement their names in the field. Waverly Hills wasn't just any haunted place. It was a legend. And legends, as they all knew, were built on truth. It had been abandoned for decades, the once proud structure now crumbling, with vines snaking up its broken walls. But the stories, the voices in the dark, the flickering lights, the footsteps that followed you through the hallways, kept the myths alive. Gabe was convinced that something in this building had been left behind, something the world wasn't ready to know, and he would be the one to uncover it. The team arrived late in the afternoon, the sun dipping below the horizon as they gathered their equipment. Cameras, sound recorders, infrared sensors, and their own nerves. The sanatorium towered before them, its windows like dark eyes watching them approach. There was a coldness in the air, something that felt wrong from the moment they stepped inside. "All right, we've got the whole night ahead of us," Gabe said, his voice trying to mask his excitement. "Let's split up. Rob, you and Amelia head to the 3rd floor. Cassie, you're with me. We'll start on the 1st floor, work our way up, keep your recorders running. We need every sound, every shadow." They moved in, their footsteps echoing off the walls. The place smelled of dust, mildew, and something older, like the staleness of forgotten memories. Gabe felt a shiver run down his spine, but pushed it aside. This was what they'd trained for. The first hour was uneventful. They explored room after room, empty save for debris and old medical equipment, relics of a time long gone. Nothing to report. Nothing but silence and the occasional creak of the building settling. But Gabe knew better. Silence in a place like this wasn't nothing. It was waiting. Around midnight, after hours of searching, they came across something odd. It was a small, unmarked door tucked away at the end of a long hallway. The door was like any other in the sanatorium, weathered, cracked, the paint peeling, but it had a weight to it, like it had been there longer than the rest. They had passed it earlier, but something had drawn them back. A subtle shift in the air, a flicker of something in the corner of their eyes. Gabe pushed the door open. The room inside was unlike any they had encountered. It was untouched by time, the dust undisturbed as if no one had entered in years. What was stranger still was that the room seemed perfectly preserved. There were personal belongings scattered around. An old suitcase, a child's toy, a leather-bound book resting on a desk. Everything looked real, as if the patients who had once occupied this space could walk back in at any moment. "This doesn't make sense," Cassie whispered. "It's like it's frozen in time." Gabe stepped inside, his flashlight sweeping over the room. The faint smell of antiseptic hung in the air, mixed with something earthy, something human. "I don't know," he murmured, kneeling next to the suitcase. "But it feels off." He reached down and opened the suitcase. Inside were clothes, neatly folded, and a small picture frame. He picked it up. It was a photograph of a young woman, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes wide, staring into the camera with an expression that was both vacant and fearful. There was something about her eyes that unsettled him, something that made his pulse quicken. He didn't want to look at it any longer. Then the temperature dropped. A sudden chill swept through the room, freezing Gabe in place. He looked over at Cassie, who was shivering beside him. "Did you feel that?" he asked, his voice tight. "Yeah," Cassie replied, her breath visible in the air. "Something's wrong. We need to get out of here." Before Gabe could respond, the door slammed shut behind them with a force that rattled the walls. The sound was deafening. The air thickened, pressing down on them, making it hard to breathe. The room, once so still, seemed to come alive. The walls groaned, the floorboards creaked, and the air began to hum, vibrating with a low, almost imperceptible frequency. And then they heard it, a voice, a whisper, faint but unmistakable. It seemed to come from everywhere, from the very walls themselves. "Leave. Leave now." Gabe's heart pounded in his chest. He moved toward the door, but the handle wouldn't budge. It was stuck, as though something on the other side was holding it shut. He slammed his shoulder into the door, but it didn't move. He looked back at Cassie, her eyes wide with terror. "Something's here," she gasped. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, rising in volume, like a chorus of voices pleading for release. Gabe turned to the room, his flashlight flickering as he swept it over the desk. The picture frame had moved. It was no longer on the desk, but on the floor, face down. Gabe bent down to pick it up. As he turned it over, the image of the young woman was no longer the same. Her eyes, once lifeless, were now filled with horror. She was looking at him, her mouth open in a silent scream. The photo seemed to pulse, to breathe. Gabe's breath caught in his throat. The room began to shake. A low rumble vibrated through the floor, and the whispers turned into screams, agonizing, desperate cries. Shadows moved in the corners of the room, swirling like smoke, twisting into shapes that weren't human. Gabe could feel them now, pressing in on him, tugging at his mind, whispering words he couldn't understand. Then it hit him, the patients, the ones who had died here, the ones whose lives had been torn apart by the disease, by the experiments. They were still here, trapped in this room, in this building. And they weren't alone. They were waiting, just like the legends said, waiting for new victims to join their ranks. Gabe spun around, grabbing Cassie's arm. "We need to get out, now!" But as they turned to leave, the door opened, and standing in the doorway, blocking their exit, was the woman from the photograph. Her face was gaunt, her eyes wild, filled with a pain that was both ancient and unbearable. Her lips parted, and the whisper came again. "You shouldn't have come." The air crackled with a sharp, otherworldly energy. And then, without another word, the room exploded with darkness, swallowing everything in its wake. When the team was found hours later, their cameras still running, they were nowhere near the room where they'd started. The footage captured only static, strange, flickering shadows that danced across the screens. No voices, no explanations, only the echo of their final screams. The room, however, was gone. The door was no longer there, just a blank wall where it had stood. And the whispers? They never stopped. They followed, haunting the air around Waverly Hills, waiting for the next unwitting souls to stumble in. The forgotten ones, trapped forever in the silence of the sanatorium. Story number 10. The Watcher in the Window. It's been years since I left Waverly Hills Sanatorium, but the memories, those damn memories, still haunt me. Especially on nights like this when the wind howls through the trees and the darkness feels like it's alive. I wasn't much, just a janitor back then, cleaning up after the doctors and patients, but I saw things. Things I'm not sure I can explain, but I'm gonna try. I started working there in the mid-60s, just after they closed the doors to the place. They said the building wasn't in use anymore, but that wasn't entirely true. It was still a place of sorts, a place for the forgotten. They didn't tell me about the history of the building, the rumors, the things that had happened in those long, empty halls. They didn't have to. I felt it the moment I walked through the front door. Waverly Hills was a place that had seen too much, and some things, well, they don't just vanish when the doors close. Most nights were the same. I'd sweep up the floors, take out the trash, and make sure the lights were off in the rooms where the windows still rattled in the wind. The air was always thick with dust and something else. A heavy, sickly feeling that pressed down on your chest, like the building itself was breathing. The nights were long, and the building was silent, save for the occasional sound of pipes creaking or the wind rattling against the cracked windows. But one night, something changed. I remember it like it was yesterday. I was on my usual route, checking the top floor, when I saw it. A figure standing in the top floor window. At first, I thought it was just the light playing tricks on me. Maybe a shadow, or the moonlight reflecting off the glass. But then it moved. It wasn't like a person moving. It was wrong, unnatural. The figure seemed to float, its outline hazy and faint, but I could see enough to know it was a man. Or at least, it looked like a man. His face was pale, too pale, like someone who'd been dead for a long time. His eyes were wide open, staring out at the horizon, locked on something far in the distance. But there was no life in those eyes. There couldn't have been. I froze in place, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew something wasn't right, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. I thought I was imagining things, but then I saw his lips move. A slow, deliberate motion, like he was trying to say something. I took a step forward, and then it happened. The figure turned, slowly, and looked directly at me. I don't know how long I stood there, but it felt like hours. His eyes, they weren't just lifeless anymore. They were filled with something cold, something that made my skin crawl. I wasn't sure if he saw me or if he was just staring through me, but I knew then, with a gut-wrenching certainty, that he wasn't just some old ghost. No, he was something worse, something that had been waiting for me. The building shifted, groaned beneath me. It was as though it knew I had seen him. It, the thing that had been lurking there, hidden away for God knows how long. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Eventually, I snapped out of it, too terrified to go near the window, too scared to even move. But I knew I had to leave. I ran out of that building like a man possessed, not stopping until I was outside and back in my truck. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely start the engine. I drove home without looking back, my heart still pounding. But it wasn't over. Over the next few weeks, the figure started to haunt me. Not just in my dreams, but during the day. I'd be walking down the street and I'd feel eyes on me. I'd turn a corner and see his face, just for a moment, hovering there in the corner of my vision. I tried to ignore it, told myself I was just tired, that my mind was playing tricks on me, but I knew. I knew what I had seen, and I knew it wasn't over. The whispers started too. Soft at first, just a low murmur in the back of my head, like a buzzing fly that wouldn't go away. Then it grew louder, until I could hear them everywhere. At work, in my sleep. In the silence of my home, I could hear them calling my name. And always, always, in the dead of night, I could feel those eyes on me. I went back to Waverly Hills, stupidly thinking maybe I could face it. Maybe I could confront whatever it was that had been haunting me. I thought maybe it would stop if I went back to the window. I had to know what it wanted. I went up to the top floor, my legs shaking, my heart hammering in my chest. The silence was deafening. I stepped to the window, my breath fogging up the glass. There was no figure, no man, but something was there, something was watching me. I could feel it, pressing against my skin, crawling up my spine. And then, there it was again. That pale, lifeless face staring out at me from the darkness. His eyes were wide, his lips moving again. But this time, I didn't need to hear the words. I knew what he was saying. Come closer. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. My body was frozen, and that was when I understood. Waverly Hills didn't just house the dead. It didn't just trap their souls. It fed on them, and it wanted me. It had always wanted me. I had been a part of the building from the moment I stepped inside. The janitor, the last one to leave the hallways empty. I had seen too much, and now the building was calling for me to join the others. I turned and ran. But no matter how fast I ran, the building's hunger followed me. The figure, the whispers, the cold eyes, they stayed with me. They never stopped. And now, I sit here, telling this story, waiting for the night when it will come for me, when the building will claim me just as it claimed all the others. The watcher in the window still waits. It's only a matter of time before I'm the next to be part of its endless hunger. If you ever find yourself near Waverly Hills, just remember this. Some places don't forget, and some things never leave.